This week, if you missed it, I covered the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism earlier this month on this podcast, doing a sweep of its origin to its largest controversy. Now let's take a look at two new anti-Semitism definitions. Why do they exist? What problems are they trying to fix? And how do they fix them? I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So to quickly refresh the why of this whole subject, part of the effort to fight anti-Semitism has now become about implementing a definition of anti-Semitism across different countries and institutions. The idea is that, with a definition, administrators and legal experts and whoever else will have more clarity and guidance about when a particular act or speech is anti-Semitic. By identifying it, that's already the first step to figuring out how to address it. The most prominent anti-Semitism definition is something called the IHRA definition, named after the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, hence IHRA, an organization made up of representatives from 34 countries, most of which are in Europe, that serves as a think tank on Holocaust education and genocide remembrance. IHRA adopted the definition in 2016, and since then many countries, sports leagues, universities, and other institutions and organizations have adopted it. And the definition has a particular focus on explaining when anti-Zionist or anti-Israel action and speech is anti-Semitic. But with its spread in recent years has come criticism. Earlier this month I covered the biggest critique, that the IHRA definition can, in some ways, threaten the free speech and activity of anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian advocates. If you haven't yet, go back and listen to that episode for the full context, because there's a lot of it. But the short of it is, at minimum, critics say that even a non-binding, non-legal IHRA definition of anti-Semitism adopted by, say, a university can make people afraid to be labeled anti-Semites and thus lead them to do less free expression. There's another issue that critics say the IHRA definition has. It's pretty vague. For example, here's the main anti-Semitism definition itself. Quote, "Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions, and religious facilities." End quote. But what exactly is a certain perception of Jews? What does that mean? And more importantly, how does that help a random university administrator figure out what is or isn't anti-Semitic? Well, the IHRA definition tries to answer that question by having 11 examples of contemporary anti-Semitism. 7 of those have to do with Israel. Many of the examples are arguably pretty straightforward. Denying the reality or the scope of the Holocaust, anti-Semitic. Saying there's a global Jewish conspiracy to control the media, politics, and the world, anti-Semitic. Also, holding all Jews responsible for Israel's actions, anti-Semitic. Saying Israel invented or exaggerated the Holocaust, anti-Semitic. Accusing Jews of being more loyal to Israel than the country in which they reside, anti-Semitic. But then you have examples that are straightforward but still leave a lot of questions. Like this one, quote, "Denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor." End quote. What qualifies under claiming that Israel's existence is a racist endeavor? This isn't a theoretical question, by the way. A lot of Jews, and in fact many Israelis, are critical of Israel's government and society for racism against Ethiopian Jews, African refugees, and Arab Israelis. Israel also does have a distinct history of institutional racism against Jews from Arab countries. So does bringing those issues up qualify as calling Israel racist? Does that then mean people are being anti-Semitic for bringing that up? And is there a distinct difference between calling Israel sort of racist and claiming Israel is racist? The degree of the racism, how much of that amounts to talking about Israel's existence or endeavor? Is this all just semantics? And in the hyper-political conversation about all of this stuff, where every slip of the tongue and easy oversimplification is both human nature and a potential scandal, it can be hard to make sense of some of the IHRA definition examples. And if Jews can't always figure it out, how is a random administrator of some random institution supposed to navigate this? None of this is made easier by the IHRA antisemitism examples being listed with the caveat that they, quote, could, taking into the overall context, include but are not limited to, end quote, these examples. So these things could also just not be anti-Semitic, which is helpful, or not, I don't know. So all of this brings us to two new anti-Semitism definitions that were released in early 2021, the Nexus document and the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. Both aim to clarify the definition and examples that should be used as a guide, and to do so in a way that redraws the line on anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian discourse to protect full political expression, action, and speech. Links to both are in the podcast notes, as I won't be covering them in their entirety here, just some of the relevant bits and context. So let's start with the Nexus document or definition. This was created by a group of prominent Jewish scholars and communal professionals associated with the Knight program in Media and Religion at the University of Southern California. According to some of the drafters of the Nexus definition, like UC Berkeley law professor David Schraub, Nexus isn't trying to replace the IHRA definition, but serve as a kind of commentary on it that helps to clarify some of the issues of vagueness. A link to one of Schraub's blog posts where he goes into greater detail about this is in the podcast notes. So here's the actual Nexus definition of anti-Semitism. Quote, anti-Semitism consists of anti-Jewish beliefs, attitudes, actions, or systemic conditions. It includes negative beliefs and feelings about Jews, hostile behavior directed against Jews because they are Jews, and conditions that discriminate against Jews and significantly impede their ability to participate as equals in political, religious, cultural, economic, or social life, end quote. So that's already much more specific than the IHRA definition's certain perception of Jews. But truthfully, most of the Nexus definition's examples of anti-Semitism are not functionally different from what the IHRA definition offers. Saying Jews or Israel are part of a global conspiracy of power and money and the media, yeah, that's anti-Semitic. Assuming Jews are all totally loyal to Israel, anti-Semitic. Holding Jews collectively guilty for the actions of Israel, anti-Semitic. All of that is in the IHRA definition in some form, but there are just more words to explain them in the Nexus definition. Remember that example from the IHRA definition of it being anti-Semitic to deny the Jewish people their right to self-determination? Well, here are the two Nexus definition examples that break that down. Quote, it is anti-Semitic to treat Israel in a negative manner based on a claim that Jews alone should be denied the right to define themselves as a people and to exercise any form of self-determination. It is anti-Semitic to advocate a political solution that denies Jews the right to define themselves as a people, thereby denying them, because they are Jews, the right to self-determination, end quote. Now, legitimately, some of the wording in there, I would argue, doesn't necessarily make this concept easier to understand at face value for, again, some random administrator of some random institution. It's harder to make an instant decision with more information to sort through. But there is definitely more context to what it means to deny Jewish self-determination, and starting with that larger context can help educate said random administrator a little more than maybe the IHRA definition's brief examples can. So it definitely feels like a little bit of a trade-off in the effort to be more specific than the IHRA definition. What's really unique about the Nexus definition, though, is that it has a section to talk about what generally isn't anti-Semitic. That's something the Jerusalem definition also has, and the IHRA definition doesn't. Now really, go read through the Nexus document to check that section out for yourself, because I'm just going to summarize it here. But you can tell how the drafters are trying to defend what they see as, legitimate pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel speech from being wholly accused of anti-Semitism. So under the Nexus definition, generally speaking, criticism of Zionism and Israel is not anti-Semitic. Harsh criticism is not anti-Semitic. Being anti-Zionist or anti-Israel is not necessarily anti-Semitic, because someone could be against all forms of nationalism, not just Jewish nationalism, Or a person may come from a Palestinian family that fled from Israel in 1948 and was unable to return to their home, so they have a very specific reason then for being anti-Israel. And interestingly enough, quote, paying disproportionate attention to Israel, end quote, is not necessarily anti-Semitic, because some people do just care about Israel more, and Israel does have a, for example, somewhat unique relationship politically and regarding military aid with the United States. So that's a pretty big exception and clarification for anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, or pro-Palestinian activism. And that exception is also really controversial to some Jews. Let's be real. For many Jews, it doesn't make a difference whether you're against Jewish nationalism only or all nationalism everywhere, because either way you're calling a Jewish state for Jews illegitimate. And yet, if Jews aren't being specifically targeted for being Jews in that situation, is that really anti-Semitism? Obviously, this could be an endless and potentially very interesting conversation, but the point is you can kind of see in real time how a document like the Nexus definition is trying to navigate what feels anti-Semitic regarding Israel versus what is anti-Semitic. And every Jew has a different answer to what that looks like, of course. In this respect, the IHRA definition feels much more black and white. So let's get to the Jerusalem Declaration on Antisemitism, which is in a similar vein to the Nexus definition, minus some key differences. The JDA was put together by a group of scholars through the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which is functionally a Zionism and Jewish think tank in, you guessed it, Jerusalem. So here's the JDA definition, quote, antisemitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews or Jewish institutions as Jewish, end quote. Clear and short. But the definition and layout is a bit different. The JDA is meant to replace the IHRA definition entirely, not sort of add on to it like Nexus. The JDA also comes with a whole preamble explaining why and how it is a response to the IHRA definition, which centers on the IHRA definition's lack of clarity. The anti-Semitism examples are now split into 3 sections for the JDA. General anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism to do with Israel, and stuff that generally isn't anti-Semitic when it comes to Israel. And like the Nexus definition before it, the JDA includes many examples that are functionally the same as what is in the IHRA definition, just with more words to explain. So to boil down some of those, associating all Jews with power and money, anti-Semitic. Minimizing the Holocaust, anti-Semitic. Overstating Israel's influence on the world and connection to power, anti-Semitic. Holding all Jews responsible for Israel, anti-Semitic. On a quick tangent, for all the stuff that Jews argue about regarding Israel, I feel like all of this just shows that there's a lot that Jews actually do agree is anti-Semitic, even regarding Israel. Make of that what you will. But where the JDA really stands out is by being further to the political left of the Nexus definition, by carving out an even bigger explicit sort of exception for anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, and pro-Palestinian activists so that they're not labeled as anti-Semites automatically. The JDA states that the boycott, divestment, and sanctions or BDS movement against Israel, seen by many Jews to be an anti-Semitic movement, is not anti-Semitic. Comparing Israel to settler colonialism or apartheid is also generally not anti-Semitic according to the JDA, and criticizing or opposing Zionism isn't generally anti-Semitic either. So JDA really goes in hard in a way that the Nexus definition doesn't, and in a way that, to be frank, many Jews are not so likely to agree with. But let's zoom out a little bit. I think there are a couple of key takeaways from all of this messing around with definitions. First of all, when you read all 3 definitions, they agree more often when they disagree, even on Israel. Second of all, the Nexus and JDA definitions are a great way to see how liberal and progressive Jews are struggling to navigate the line between anti-Israel speech I disagree with and am uncomfortable about, and anti-Israel speech that I definitely consider anti-Semitic, as well as tackling some other issues, like Nexus including, as an example of anti-Semitism, denying someone's Jewish identity because they don't have the right position on Israel. That is such internal baseball, and yet it points to a significant conversation in the Jewish community about how we're all, supposed to get along, but to super duper generalize, half of us think the other half of us is anti-Semitic in some way and doesn't represent Judaism. And sometimes that happens while having nothing to do with Israel. The third big takeaway, in my opinion, tying all of that together, is that I think it may be too late for the JDA and the Nexus definition to be more than a conversation starter. The IHRA definition is everywhere in the Jewish community, and it really is a global phenomenon now. And despite being kind of vague in some senses, it is shorter and more direct than both the Nexus and the JDA definitions, and again, does not differ all that substantially from the newer definitions, even with a lot of the Israel stuff. Looking at college campuses in the US, where a lot of the fight is now for adopting a definition of anti-Semitism, Jewish campus organizations and students are focused on the IHRA definition. I can't help but feel like JDA and Nexus are maybe really important, but they're also academic experiments by comparison. I mean, the organized campus Jewish community in most places tends to think that BDS is anti-Semitic, so why would they support the JDA definition? And if Nexus is basically an add-on for the IHRA definition, then why not keep things simple and just pass the IHRA definition anyway? And it's also worth mentioning that for all the debate about the IHRA definition, maybe it's more flexible than some critics give it credit for, particularly when you cut out all the political posturing. In the podcast notes is a really interesting JTA story about how, a couple months ago, the University of Iowa went through a campus debate about anti-Semitism, Zionism, and whether or not the Jewish community deserved its own student senator on campus. What's notable is that national Jewish and Israel organizations stayed away from the University of Iowa as this debate was playing out. There was no huge national scandal, no articles in Tablet magazine about Jews being attacked in Iowa and how Jewish parents shouldn't send their kids to higher education institutions anymore. The Jewish students quietly talked it out on campus in the student government. They dealt with it themselves. By the end, they did get a student senator representing the Jewish community as part of a bill passed in 45 minutes of discussion. And as part of that, the student government debated adopting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Facing concerns about free speech on campus, the students decided to adopt the IHRA definition just without the example of anti-Semitism about calling Israel a racist endeavor. Now, is that a perfect thing in the eyes of many Jews? No. But Jewish students compromised and got the rest of the definition through. It worked for them. That kind of compromise obviously isn't possible in every community, but I do think this story gives us the most important lesson when it comes to all of this stuff. We've got 3 definitions of anti-Semitism now. We can fight over them all day long, but ultimately the effort to fight anti-Semitism is something based in local communities, where Jews living in a place know best how to address anti-Semitism in that place. A definition is a start, which is great, but it's also just a start. No one will ever agree fully about any of the definitions or any of the potential ways to implement them, which is hilarious because they all say mostly the same stuff. But if you think 3 different people with the IHRA definition will respond exactly the same to every incident of anti-Semitism, you are wrong. If you think Facebook or the US State Department, by adopting any definition of anti-Semitism, will stick to it perfectly forever, you are wrong. Facebook, as part of their hate speech policy, banned Holocaust denial a few months ago. And guess what? There's still Holocaust denial on Facebook's platforms. The real question is, how do we move on actually addressing anti-Semitism? If getting a move on in a certain community means adopting part of a definition, because that's how far compromise gets you, fine. Let's get to the next step then and keep going. If getting a move on means the ability to adopt an entire definition, great. There's still more work to do, though. None of this is a perfect process, and maybe we, the Jews, need to cool off the debates on definitions a little bit, slow down with this proxy war over Israel, and focus more on the bigger plan to address anti-Semitism in our communities. Because, and if you're sick of hearing me say this, I'm sick of saying it too, even on Israel, all 3 of these definitions say functionally the same thing about what is anti-Semitic. Don't believe me? The links are in the podcast notes. Read the whole things. They're not actually that long. And maybe bridging that commonality, though imperfect, is a better place to start with addressing anti-Semitism as a cohesive Jewish community than doing more internal baseball over this stuff. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringauz. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com. A link to the transcript of this episode is available in the podcast notes.